Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Graduate Dentist Podcast, your go-to guide through real-world dentistry and a community amongst graduates. My name is Erica Quinn, and this is our last official episode for the year before we wrap things up for the holiday season. And I don't know about you, but 2024 has absolutely flown by, and it's been a really tough and rough crawl to the finish line, but we are almost there. And I am so glad we get to end things on a high with this wonderful chat with Dr. Bharat Agrawal and Dr. Yohan Choi. I think this episode in particular, as I was re-listening and editing it, was one that I really appreciated getting to sit down and take in everything that was said. There were so many moments that I really just stopped and reflected on the philosophies that Bharat and Yohan share towards dentistry, and they're ones that I really resonate with. And I think it's a really important message to be sharing with our audience, particularly when we say time and time again that there is so much noise on social media, and as graduates, it's hard to know what to take in and what to filter out. It's easy to get caught up in all the smoke and the mirrors and to constantly be chasing the next big thing that we forget the impact, the responsibility, and the service we owe to both our patients and our profession, and what it truly means to be a good general dentist. It's easy to always want to be doing more, but is it really that we should be chasing more? Or is it that we really need to be doing what we're already doing really, really well? It is such an honor and a privilege to be in the position that we are to get to serve our patients. And so do we not owe it to them to do a really good job? And so this is a reminder that you don't have to be doing flashy things, and you don't have to keep constantly trying to keep up with what everyone else is doing to be a good dentist. We're here, in Yohan's wise words, to make general dentistry sexy again, to remind ourselves and celebrate the powerful impact we can have as good general dentists in helping taking care of the oral health of our patients by diagnosing, intervening early, treatment planning well, and ensuring that their teeth last them as long as it possibly can. As Bharat would say, our job is to do the least amount of dentistry to get our patients to where they deserve to be. In this episode, we talk about the concept of being a super GTP and dispel perhaps some of the misconceptions about what that term really means, and how it's not necessarily being able to do absolutely every possible treatment, but rather being able to see. I think oftentimes when we graduate, we think we know how to treatment plan, but the reality is what we understand is really just the tip of the iceberg. The more I practice dentistry, the more I realize how little I know, and the more I realize how much there is to learn. And the more I realize that the biggest impact we can have on our patients is not necessarily being able to perform the treatment, but having the capacity to foresee what will happen in every given scenario, to have an understanding not just of an individual tooth, but of how all their teeth come together, how their health, how their soft tissues, their caries risk, their structural integrity, their occlusion, their risk factors, how all of that comes together, and to be able to plan not just a solution, but foresee all the hurdles and challenges that may come our way and how we are able to fix things when things go wrong. It's clear from this conversation just how passionate Bharat and Yohan are with the message that they want to share with their students when they teach. And as such big role models for so many of us, it's really motivating to see just how seriously Bharat and Yohan take their responsibility regarding the influence and impact that they have on young dentists and shaping our profession and our attitude towards dentistry. I'm really grateful to get to end the year with this episode, and I hope you're all able to take the time to really sit with and reflect on all the messages shared as you have some downtime throughout this holiday season and as we get ready to launch into the new year. And to end things off with an even bigger bang, we have an awesome Christmas giveaway for our lucky listeners. Thanks to Bharat and Yohan and Dr. David Attia, we are doing a competition to give away the full bespoke dental education course curriculum, which includes Stratum, Recon, Illuminate, Emerge, and Integrate. Valued at over $12,000, these courses cover everything from composite artistry to adhesive indirect dentistry, alveolar ridge preservation and basic implantology, implant restorations, and clinical photography for those beautiful aesthetic case presentations, so that you have everything under your belt to also become a phenomenal dentist. It is open to final year students and graduate dentists less than 2 years out, and we'll be announcing our lucky winner on Christmas Eve. And so keep your eyes peeled on our socials over the next couple of days when we officially launch the competition. In the meantime, I hope you guys enjoy this final wrap up with Bharat and Yohan. Bharat and Yohan, Welcome to the Graduate Dentist Podcast.
Hi, Erica. Lovely to be with you here on a Sunday morning. I think it's been a long time coming, but yeah, really happy to be here. Yeah, we have. I think all three of us are so busy, so it's really nice to be here finally.
Yeah, no, so honoured to be here, Erica. Yeah, it's been, like you said, a long time coming, and it was great to meet you last year at our course. So I think we've been chatting about it since. So here we are, finally made it happen.
Was it last year? It was earlier this year. Like, I mean, in
Was
August,
it?
I think,
No.
but it feels like last year.
Was it August?
Yeah, it was only a few months ago.
Well, you know what they say, Erica. You know when you get old, time just is a blur. You were the one who told us we were old anyway, right? So too old to join the Discord group anyway. So I think that's what happens, right? So when you're our age, Erica, you'll
my God,
time will just go like a blur.
Every day's a blessing. Every day's a blessing, right? Every day you wake up is a blessing at the moment.
Oh man. Oh, well, I was thinking, and actually, that was my first question. I was going to ask, like, a trip down memory lane, just so to show how old all of us are. Actually, do you guys remember when you first got Instagram? I was thinking about it this morning. I'm like, wow, Instagram's been around for a while. Do you guys remember when you first got it?
The undertone here is that we are old. I'm feeling
thinking
this
about
already.
it as well.
I think Instagram was like the Wild West back then. It was because Instagram had just like sort of started to sort of develop. It's just been released. I don't think anyone really in Australia was on Instagram at the time. But I think okay, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. But I think Instagram back then, not many people on it. But I think it was still the same in terms of, I'm sure you found, with your community as well, Erica, that I think dentists, especially young dentists coming out, they yearn to be a part of a community. There's a lot, there's a lot of synergy from those relationships as well. And, I think it was hard, and I think it's, really great what you're doing. You're providing a platform for these young dentists to really come and connect with each other, help with, be their support network, for each other. And for us at that time, there wasn't really that. If you think about how hostile platforms like DPR and stuff can be nowadays, DPR was pretty hostile back then as well. Probably even more so because young dentistry didn't really have a voice. And, I think for us, it was, really an issue of, well, we need to find a platform elsewhere to really try and connect with young dentists. Our colleagues at the time, you say that we're not young. So, again, our colleagues are not as young anymore either. But at the time, Instagram was a perfect place. It provided a platform that was away from the eyes of older dentists potentially. It seemed like a safer place at the time. And obviously now it's changed a lot, right?
Yeah, I remember back when we started with Instagram, it was really just the fact that we wanted to obviously, do everything Yohan was saying, but it gave us a real opportunity to connect with not only people around us, but people around the world. And I think that was kind of what was really cool about Instagram. It wasn't geographically constricted as to who you could communicate with, who you could share with. And, realistically, a lot of people that, I would call mentors and even people that I bounce cases off now are people that I met over Instagram and people that I hadn't really met in person until, a few years ago, but really shared similar philosophies. And I think that was really cool. The fact that we were sort of in different places, different demographics, different cultural situations as well with, what kind of dentistry you could provide. But really the philosophy was exactly the same. And I think that's really what was exciting about it at the time, that there was just people who felt the same way about dentistry as you did. And I think that was, really what got us excited about at the start was, that sort of connection.
But I think there was a real excitement, Erica, in terms of, and it was the same in most countries where there weren't many people on Instagram at all. And so it was really an exciting time in the sense that there were versions of us, people that we, mentors, colleagues who were trying to do the same thing in their countries. So you'd get these, random people in the US, the UK, India. So it wasn't limited to, really it wasn't limited geographically at all. All walks of life. And it was really cool how everyone was really united in the sense that everyone wanted to create that community. And Instagram obviously is a bit different now. It's very established, and I think it's harder to stand out nowadays. But it was actually a safe place back then. It was more a safer place back then. It was really cool.
Well, the reason I ask, and Brad, it's definitely not an attack on us, you guys being old or anything, but I was talking to some friends just the other day and just talking about, I guess, the evolution of social media, right? And some of my older friends obviously were there when DPR was taking off and was the main platform that people would share cases and It's interesting to hear you make that comment, Johan, that even then, as new grads for yourselves, it was that kind of hostile environment. And then you guys went to Instagram and saw that as your safe haven. But then Instagram's been around for like quite a number of years now. As you said, it's really well established. And then for someone like myself, like I only made my dental account maybe a year or 2 years ago. Yeah. And then a lot of new grads are now, creating dental Instagram separate from their own personal or social personal accounts, but entering this field of something that's already well established. And so I guess we don't really have that hindsight of seeing that growth. Like Instagram now is all we know it to be, right? Or Facebook now is all we know it to be. And people have been asking me, like, oh, well, you've started this whole Discord channel. Like, what do you see it to become? And I'm like, I don't know. I've only been running it for 2 weeks. Right? I don't know what it's going to become. But I guess I kind of related to a lot of the comments you guys made about a safe space, I guess, away from the eyes of, I guess, the problem of when things grow big and become really well established is you get a lot of opinions, right? And creating that Discord right now where it's just limited to the grads and it really means it's a safe space. People can ask questions. There's no judgment. And yeah, just really nurturing that kind of community. But I don't know what it'll become. Yeah. Discord's
Yeah.
obviously something new and yeah.
What we did back in the day, Erica, and what you're doing now, it's very much aligned in the sense that, you'll all, I think people yearn to have a safe space to talk. Dentistry itself can be a very isolating profession, very stressful, emotionally charged at times as well. And I think, to be able to relate to colleagues, because we naturally, dentistry is not a profession where you work in a team, right? Yes, you work with auxiliary staff and everything, but in terms of working with other dentists, and a lot of young dentists nowadays coming out working solo, right? Mentorship's not really available in a lot of places. And so it can be very lonely, I feel. So I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic, especially in light of how Instagram has changed. I think, young dentists definitely need a place to, connect and share their, daily stresses.
It's funny, Eric, you probably don't remember this at all, but we, before we did Instagram, Yohan, myself, and a couple of others, we actually started a Facebook group called Next Generation Dentists. And it was like our big thing at the time to go, hey, this is our safe space for new grads. So I think there's a real sort of, full circle moment here, hearing you talk about what you're trying to create, really the challenges that clinicians face and dentists face, I think through eternity don't really change. Like it's just little cycles of the same thing happening over and over again. And, probably pre-Instagram, pre-Facebook, who knows? I
There
don't know,
was
maybe the
something there, study
maybe the
clubs,
community,
right?
maybe the community library
Yeah.
that had exactly, the study clubs, and that was their safe space. So I think we're pretty lucky that those safe spaces are easier to come by and more accessible. You don't have to necessarily leave the comfort of your home to feel part of something. And I think that's what's really cool about, like even DPR and stuff, Facebook and everything else that's going on. All those platforms give you an opportunity to really stay connected when you're, when it is lonely. You're stuck at lunch by yourself and you're the only clinician in the practice on that day and things didn't go quite to plan, or you're having that introspective moment where you're struggling with something. You almost want to reach out and find someone that's feeling the same way as you, or who can support you, or who has been through that before, which invariably everyone has.
Yeah, I love that. I guess it's something that's evergreen, right? Like every year people will still graduate, you'll still go through all the same trials and tribulations. Johan, you made a comment earlier that I wanted to circle back on where you said that, you still feel like you still remember what it's like to be a grad. And I remember us talking about it after Stratum as well, where you sat down, you said that as a new graduate, one of the things that you felt was that you didn't really have any strong role models to look up to when you graduated. In that, and perhaps at that time, Instagram wasn't around and it wasn't so easy to find people that you looked up to. It wasn't so easy to, I guess, approach them for mentorship either. But you were saying that like mentors were hard to come by and you didn't really have
Yeah.
any, or at least a lot of those senior dentists were specialists or people that you didn't feel were so
Yeah.
approachable. And then I guess as you became more experienced yourself, you really wanted to be that approachable role model figure. And I think the both of you have done that really well. And that obviously, us talking about Instagram is that you've really established yourselves on these platforms, but as mentors, as role models, as people that a lot of us new grads look up to. And you've tried to be approachable, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think now being on the other end as well, Erica, it's you remember growing up, and it might be something that's only really said in a lot of Asian households, but I remember like my mum and dad always telling me, when I was younger and I didn't understand quite their perspective, they'd always say, just wait till you get to our age. Just wait till you're in our shoes. You'll understand why we're saying what we're saying, right? And at the time, I just didn't get it. So I think it's one of those things where, yeah, yes, I think there was an issue with the lines of communication. Older dentists, more established dentists weren't necessarily accessible. Not easy to communicate with them, and perhaps I don't necessarily think it's that I don't think it's necessarily that they weren't open to communicating with younger dentists. I think it just wasn't a common thing back then, and I think the lines of communications just probably weren't open, right? But I guess looking back, and I think now, in my old age, Erica, you end up being a little bit more sort of nostalgic, and you sort of go down memory lane a little bit, right? You look back on your life. It feels like sometimes it's like, Ray, you may be too young, but you remember that show, Ray Martin, This Is Your Life? You may be too young for that. So really showing our
What?
age. We're really showing our age now, Erica, right? But looking back, I think it's one of those things where I think when I was younger, I would always blame old dentists for not being there for us. And but now in my old age, I look back and I go, oh, maybe a big at least half the problem was myself, right? And I think in my youth, I didn't really understand how I should be approaching these people. How you know how to approach them, what was the right manner in which to approach them, because I think, and I think we'll probably talk about things like mentorship and stuff later as well. I think there's two parts to the equation. Yes, the mentor has to be ready to mentor and teach and, share what they know. But at the same time, I think there's a really important part in terms of like the mentee, in terms of, do they have the right attitude? Are they asking the right questions? Are they coming in with the right intentions? So, yeah.
I think that's interesting that you have that perspective. I think my experience was, it's interesting because I feel like we've taken a very similar journey, Johan, and we've sort of ended up almost at a similar endpoint. But, my sort of early memories of graduating were a little bit different in the sense that uh, I feel like I had a lot of great mentors around me. And I guess for me, I was very lucky that I fell into practices where there were clinicians who I felt were really solid, great general dentists who really did dentistry for the love of just serving their patients. And I think that's really something that sort of resonated with me throughout that whole time, was the fact that I had all these people shaping me. But for me, even the specialists that were around me, I felt they were really quite accessible. And maybe it was because they were the specialists that I was referring to, and they were, there was a reason for them to build that relationship with, a new general dentist in the area. But, I was that annoying clinician who would call a specialist. And it's funny thinking about this retrospectively. I would call them at the most random time. Like during the day, I'd get my staff to call and be like, oh, hey, can you see if Dr. So-and-so is free to chat about this patient? Like they had nothing better to do except, field my call and talk about this one patient that I needed help with. And the amount of times I would have called them about the most menial things, like, hey, should I do this, or should I refer this, or how do we manage this? And it's funny that all of them really did give me the time of day to guide me through those moments. And I think back on that now, 15 years later, and go, oh, like I was so lucky in my journey that people were happy to give me that time to guide me. So I think everyone's journey is different, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the end outcome is going to be different as well. And I think a lot of it is sort of driven by yourself. And I think that's maybe where it's quite nice that, Johan and I, although we're very similar now, we have a very, maybe a very dissimilar journey in certain aspects as well, which is kind of nice.
But Brett, I would actually say that it's probably not too dissimilar. I guess that point really relates to the fact that, being quite similar in many respects. I don't think it was, and that's what I was saying in terms of, I don't think necessarily it was like the specialists and stuff not being necessarily available. I really put that blame on myself, because I think it was like a mental block in terms of me thinking that they were inaccessible. And therefore, because of that sort of that invisible barrier that I'd put up, I probably wasn't approaching them the right way. I think that's where maybe our points are very similar, in the sense that, I think you can always go searching for mentors, but you have to be brave enough to go and ask first.
Let's break that down a bit more, Johan. Like in hindsight, what do you think about your approach wasn't the best? Was it how you were going to them, the questions, your attitude? Like what was it that, and I guess advice for new grads who are wanting to go seek mentorship?
Yeah, look, I think there's like, for me personally, I think there was a big challenge in terms of going from that dental school environment into the real world, right? Because when you're in dental school, and I don't know how many people are in cohorts now, but I think in our year, there were probably 60 people in our year. So you're there with 60 people, all the time, and you don't really get a perspective of how big the community is, right? All is, whether you want to use the word competing or, yes, uni, you talk about grades and things like that, but you're in a controlled setting, small group, and your reference points are your colleagues, right? People who have been doing dentistry or learning about dentistry for the same amount of time. And when you come into the real world, you're now obviously competing against people who have been practicing for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Like, it's such a large community, right? People have, from all walks of life who have experienced very different things as well. So I think, when having graduated from dentistry, undergrad, I'm sure, a lot of us are the same, but, I was 23 when I graduated, still very young, lacking life experience. And I think, being, and I think I was a pretty decent dental student. So I think there was a certain element of, there might have been like an unwarranted arrogance. I think maybe I probably was a bit cocky as well. And I think that really translated into probably the way I was approaching people, right? And I think that was not conducive to, to asking for mentorship in the right way. So, and that's why I think that relates back to what I was saying earlier. I put a lot of the blame of not having mentors on myself because I probably had character faults at the time. Still very well may exist to this day as well, to a lesser extent. But I think, I do put a lot of the blame on myself in terms of not being able to find the right mentors. But having said that, I think where I really started learning things as well is that, I think as young grads now, especially with social media, we think that we have to be mentored by people at the very top of the profession, right? We all have a yearning to be mentored by the best of the best of the best. And I think what one of my first jobs showed me as well is that, like, so I did have mentors along the way, but probably not in the form that I had originally envisaged. And like looking back now, I may not have called them a mentor at the time, but now very much so. Like, especially when I'm speaking, like lecturing internationally, I make a note to make sure that that I acknowledge who has shaped my journey and shaped me along the way. And some of those faces are people probably, are people that most have never heard of, who I now look back and go like, they have had such a profound influence on me now, not only as a clinician, but as a human being. And I hope, and because of them, I'm a much better person for it as well.
There's a lot that comes with leaving university and properly adulting that no one really prepares you for. As a new grad with an income and newfound responsibilities we don't know what to do with, managing finances can be really tough. That's where JS Medical and Dental Finance comes in. Specializing in financing options tailored to medical and dental professionals, JSMDF is a completely independent broker dedicated to finding the best bank and lender for your unique situation. Led by the incredible Jason Savage, who personally came to my rescue and worked his magic and helped me secure a loan before I even started working, JSMDF is committed to supporting you throughout your personal and professional journey in whatever way you need. Whether you're looking to buy a house, a car, a practice, or pay off that year-long CPD course you signed yourself up for, JSMDF offer comprehensive advice tailored to your short and long-term plans. Their goal is to be with you from day one and thoroughly understand your financial needs and provide solutions that best work for you. And so if you're looking for some advice or you simply want to explore your options, get in touch with Jason and his team. A big thank you to JSMDF for helping make being an adult that extra bit easier and for supporting the graduate dentist community. I really like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be like super flash or actually it reminds me of when I did my very first episode with Ben and we were talking about that was actually probably when this whole idea of creating a separate forum, like where that idea came from. I was actually like chatting with Ben about it and we were saying how you don't necessarily need someone who's like chapters ahead of you in order to provide value and to mentor or guide you. They can literally just be a few pages ahead. And even like, sometimes you get the most value from someone who's literally just been where you were and you can get so much from that. So I like that kind of sentiment. Sometimes mentorship isn't necessarily, have to be people from at the top of their game. And oftentimes those people may not be readily available, but those around you can really give you a lot. Did you have thoughts on that, Bharat?
Yeah, absolutely. I think mentors come in different shapes and sizes. And I think really it's not about having one mentor, but it's about having like a group of people that you look to and look up to. And I think we went through this as well. And our I think it's harder now because you see so much and there's so much information out there and so many people are, broadcasting and showcasing what they're doing that it's very difficult to sort of pick who to look up to, and you sort of end up getting almost sort of paralysis and getting almost losing direction because there's so many different people that you might want to emulate or look up to or aspire to be like. And, for us, it's maybe a little bit easier because there's only really a handful of people that were either published or in textbooks or, lecturing, presenting. You go, hey, this is kind of who I want to be. And it's very easy for us to just look up to them. But also then the same challenges sort of arise going, is that really the right person to look up to at that point in your career where you're so far away? And I think we all have these sort of grand visions and plans to go, this is who we want to be. But I think we need to remember that, like you said, there's a stepwise approach to getting there. And sometimes it is just that person who's done it, just before you. Or really, I think fundamentally, for me, what helped me keep that sort of grand vision alive for myself, so I was aspiring and pushing myself, was to really look at clinicians around me who are doing amazing, really solid general dentistry every single day. Because, as far as I sort of see dentistry, as much as I love the, semi sort of niches that I've found myself in, doing every single day, really the crux of what I do as a clinician is what I signed up to, and that's to help people, eradicate themselves of disease, doing basic fillings and caries control and diagnosis and stabilization. And I think that's where, as a new grad, that's really where the focus needs to be. And I think once you sort of build on those foundations, but you still have that grand vision, it's not about being someone who just does potentially, what you would classify as bread and butter dentistry every single day, if that's not what you want to do. But I think that's really sort of, the fundamentals of, I think, what I sort of looked for when I first graduated was, how do I do things, basic things really well? And I remember some of the conversations that I would have at lunchtime with, people who I'm in business with now who were my clinical mentors at the time, were silly things like, how do you restore a back-to-back class? Do you put one matrix band in? Do you put two in? Do you use a tophomide? Do you use a
We've
sectional?
all asked that question. I've had that exact same conversation with my mentors.
That's kind of, and it was always silly things like, what happens when I, cut the floor of the mouth? How many sutures do I put in? Like, like things that happen once, don't happen again, but they happen at the start. You really need those, those really solid mentors around you. But at the same time, like, I think it's good to have that sort of grand vision of where you want to go, and you never want to lose sight of the dream for yourself. Because I mean, that's what's exciting about dentistry, is that there is so much to learn, there's so much growth that continues to happen. And I think just finding the right people at the right time is important.
I love this, Brett, and I love that's kind of where you've taken the conversation, because the theme of the podcast is not Yohan and Brad are old, but the theme that I
Oh,
really
really?
wanted.
Oh, really? Oh, I was under that impression, Erica. Okay. All right.
It wasn't my intention in this episode. My
Oh my
intention
gosh,
was really
geriatric dentistry 101, right? Not how to treat old people, how to be an old dentist. Oh gosh.
It wasn't my intention at all. The theme that I really wanted to, I guess, like wrap the episode around was this concept of being super GPs, or being really excellent general dentists, which I think both of you are, and a lot of people look up to you guys for being. And I remember, like, obviously what you preach on your Instagram account, Yohan, is make general dentistry sexy again, right? It's just people really, we aspire. And I think, as you said, Brad, it's good to have those big dreams of, doing all an X and doing full mouth rehabs and everything. But you do need to have that really solid foundation and solid core. And that's kind of what you guys have done. And I think what also sets you guys apart within the industry as well is, previously a lot of courses and whatnot were run by specialists, run by people, that were at the top of the game. And then I guess you guys were kind of pioneers in the field of being really solid general dentists that were then teaching other general dentists how to do general dentistry to a high level, to a really, good quality.
Yeah, I think what's so important, if when we're talking about that concept of a super GDP, Erica, I think first and foremost is to probably define what that term actually means, because I think, it's important to define that and sort of set when we talk about goals and everything. So I think when Brad and I sort of set out to become like super GDPs or whatever, so becoming a super GDP, I don't think is to become a specialist without a specialist title, Erica. I think that's really important to clarify to begin with. Like, so I'm very proud to be a general dentist. I like being a general dentist because it gives me exposure to a very wide range of dentistry every day, right? You get to do the bread and butter, the super simple stuff, all the way to the more complex. And it also gives me an opportunity to refer cases on that are outside of my scope or outside of my skill level. So I think a super GDP really, is to just, is to be excellent at what a general dentist should be able to do. And if that still involves hygiene, it still involves fissure sealants, general restorative, general crown and bridge, adhesive, conventional, moving into the bigger cases as well, because as you become more experienced, you're going to be able to tackle bigger cases when you become proficient at things. And I think all of those things, as long as you've done further training on those things, are within the scope of a general dentist, right? And I think it's really up to the general dentist to then decide what is within and outside of that scope. But it's about being, having that philosophy of excellence and wanting to really help our patients, achieve optimal health. And I think the longer we do this, I guess, it's really sexy and really cool to do like, full mouth rehabilitation, all on X cases. But probably what like my bigger passion is when I see my younger patients, I really want to make sure that I'm preventing them from needing their rehab, diagnosing tooth wear, like, constricted occlusions, occlusal dysfunctions earlier, putting in the appropriate preventive strategies, and then also making sure that, things like perio are treated earlier so that my young patients aren't going to end up like my full arch cases, right? And I think that's really important. And I think in this day and age where, Instagram as well is a lot about, flashy dentistry. I think as young people as well, and I'd like to clarify that I still like to classify myself as a young person. So Erica, I identify as a young person, so please respect my identity, please. Um, right?
Yeah.
I think we believe in sort of instant gratification as well, right? And I think it's very easy for us to forget what we're really here to do. And I think it's really to keep our patients healthy.
I'd agree with that completely. I think I would never, it's interesting you use the word super GP or super GDP. I'd probably have never thought about that or referred to myself as that before. But, thinking about it based on what, you're saying, what Johan's just said, I think realistically what sets us apart, as far as sort of, where I was 15 years ago, is just that ability to see and have like a greater, wider vision of what a patient needs, whether it's prevention, whether it's, when we are intercepting, having a very clear vision and picture and overview of what is possible in dentistry. And I think that's what I think experience and increasing your knowledge base affords you, is the ability to see something and see the endpoint, in a very quick manner, but then to be able to then decipher that in a very systematic way for the patient to understand it, and also to, even if you're not doing all the treatments, I'm the first to say that I don't do every element of dentistry and I don't do every aspect of dentistry really well, but I have built a team around me that allows me to do a case from A to Z exceptionally well. But realistically, I see it as, if they're my patient, the vision is mine. It's my responsibility to make sure they're in the best hands for every sort of element of each part of that treatment. So I definitely wouldn't say that I'm a super GDP because I don't do every element of dentistry to an exceptionally high standard, but I can envision every element of dentistry for a patient I feel these days to go, hey, this is what's possible and this is what modern dentistry can afford them. And this is the most optimal way to achieve that for that patient. And I think that's really probably my biggest advice to anyone sort of, starting out in their careers, is not to start doing that, all on X course or doing, that full mouth reconstruction course or the veneer course or whatever it is. Start with, doing all those things, but intertwine that with, the basics of diagnosis and planning and anything that's going to help develop that ability to, foresee what's going to happen to your patients. And I think that's really, I think Johan and I's journey, that's where we kind of sort of aligned and met, was when we started doing, some of our postgraduate stuff where, as much as maybe we didn't learn each of the elements of what we do day to day clinically, I think a lot of our vision and philosophy and the ability to see was maybe shaped during that period of our careers where, we were looking at things very comprehensively. So I think that's probably my definition of a super GDP, someone who can see, really. We sure should be able to see, but we need to see.
It's so true that, and we often keep coming back to this concept that, particularly as grads, is you don't know what you don't know. And, even reflecting on, coming to the end of my second year now, comparing my first year to my second year. First year was really just getting used to being a dentist and how to hold a handpiece and, see patients, like 10, 15 patients a day, like all of those things. There's so much learning that comes in the first year with just getting used to working as a dentist. But I think we probably don't realize how little we know. Like reflecting back, I'm like, I really didn't know treatment planning. I really didn't understand diagnosis. And I feel like this year, from all my mentors and the courses that I've done, it's a lot of learning that and seeing. And then now I'm looking back on the patients that I saw in my first year. I was like, wow, I missed so much, right? Like you're so fixated on just one thing, but I'm like, oh, assessing them as a whole, like so many things that I just didn't realize last year just because I didn't know what I was looking for.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that becomes more and more as you practice as well, Erica.
Yeah.
We still practice now. And I'll be looking at my patients now, from last year and going,
Yeah.
yeah, because you'll always know more, in the future than you do today. And I think really related to your point, Erica, as well, is that that's a very normal part of improving and an important part of your personal development professionally as well. And I guess the main thing is that it's very easy for us, and I think a lot of dentists are quite analytical. A lot of us reflect on our performance as well. In a lot of ways, we're like elite athletes, right? We don't get afforded bad days. We have to be at peak performance, every day clinically. And I think it's really easy on that note as young dentists as well, where as you're learning, you might be making more mistakes as well, to look back and beat yourself up over what you don't know. You might be looking at yourself from a year ago and going, oh, I really should have picked that up. But you can't beat yourself up over that, right? Because it's a part of development, improving every day. And you just have to really take that on board and sort of make sure that you continue that journey, to make sure that you become the best version of yourself.
One of my favorite quotes that or stories that you shared during the Stratum course, Johan, and I ended up bringing it up in one of my previous episodes as well, was your comment about being elite athletes. I'm not an elite athlete, so the fact that you made that analogy is probably the closest I'll ever feel to one. Um, but you're talking about the concept of marginal gains and just the
Yeah.
accumulation of it, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's sort of like, I think, as I said earlier, we all have our grand vision of what we think we need to be or what we think we deserve to be. But no one, I think, if you look at people who are truly successful in the field, I look at my mentors, a lot of my mentors now, and some of them are like, insanely successful. You look at them and none of them got to where they were overnight. It really sort of like, a lot of blood, sweat and tears went into where they went, a lot of hard work. And really it's that marginal gains concept where they just try to be better, every day with 1%. And some of them have insane talent. Some of them are less talented, but in the grand scheme of things, none of that talent would have been, worth anything unless they worked really hard at what they were doing.
Brett, you made a comment before about things that we should focus on in our early years, and I think I spoke to you a little bit in person about it as well. We're saying, as much as it is important to learn, the flashy stuff that your passion is and your interest is, it's important to understand the fundamentals as well. For a lot of our students and people that are about to graduate
Mhm.
very soon, a lot of people want to know like what should you be focusing on, what should you be learning on, what should you be trying to upskill in your early years, like what CPD should you do? There's so much, like you said, there's almost too much now. And what do we dive into? What are your thoughts on what a young dentist should be focusing on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think realistically, in the first couple of years of practice, my advice is really to do courses in really every discipline, because at the end of the day, you don't really know what you're passionate about until you've done it for a few years as a practicing clinician. What I was passionate about as a dental student, I loved perio as a fifth year. I couldn't think of it's like the least. It's probably like probably slightly above endo, but it's at the bottom of my list of things that I probably want to specialize in if I was ever going to go and specialize. But you just don't know what you don't know. So I think early on, you want to really focus on everything. I think that's going to help develop that vision that I was talking about earlier of, that overall view of the patient. I think when you're starting out, it seems common sense and cliche, but I think the basics are so important. I think, obviously diagnoses, disease control, even basic things like effectively removing caries. I think those are the things that I genuinely struggled with when I first graduated. I held my breath when I got my first bite wings back after 2 years being in the same practice, going, what did I do well? What did I not do well? But I think it's about being critical in that point of saying, hey, I need to evaluate my outcomes. I can't just expect everything's going to be perfect. So I think once you've sort of worked on the basics, you do want to progress. And I think doing, some more advanced CPD is a good idea. But I guess the way that I would frame that is, if you are going to be doing advanced CPD and start doing advanced procedures, the biggest bit of advice I can give anyone is whenever you embark on a case or start a treatment or start delivering certain types of treatments is thinking about your contingency plan of what happens if something goes wrong, or what happens when things fail. How does that serve the patient, and how do you correct that for the patient as well? Do you have the skill set or the ability to jump in and do that, or even be able to diagnose that something has gone wrong? You sort of mentioned you don't know what you don't know at the start. And I think until you've got that experience and that foresight, I would say be cautious at the start, because those are the cases that really, I think, knock your confidence. When you sort of start doing something really amazing, you feel really, really good about it, but then things go wrong. That's when your confidence takes 2 steps back, and you're not really progressing or growing at that point. That almost, can stop you from, even looking at that sort of area to work on. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, you need to know how to solve every single problem or be able to diagnose every single problem, but I guess ensuring that you're in an environment that supports that. And I think that's where, say, you're in a practice where you have mentors, you have clinicians with greater experience than yourself. I think having that humility to ask them for help to start with, and when things aren't going well, to ask them, how to intervene at that point. And even if things are going well, approaching that with humility to go, hey, what can I do better? Because they may look at that case with experience and say, these are the 5 things that I would have done differently, or this is why I think this case, may fail sooner than it should. And I think that's such a big part of that early journey is, once you've got that skill set, is how you actually implement it. And you want to implement straight away, but do it in a safe method. We've all done CPE that looks amazing and you feel really excited about it whilst you're doing it, but then you go back to practice and it's all gone over your head, and you're kind of like, where do I start now? Let me just pick up the scalpel and have a shot. And that's really not what our patients deserve, right? So it's, that's sort of a bit of a long-winded answer. I think do a bit of everything to start with, but the basics are so important. But I think when it comes to the implementation, that's almost the most important thing with any sort of CPD is it something they can implement straight away in a safe manner.
Erica, he rambles a lot in his old age, doesn't he?
I've forgotten that with relativity time, right?
Yeah.
That was just 5 seconds of talking.
We can talk about my learnings in my old age as well. I've got plenty of thoughts on that. Don't you worry. That's for the older graduates podcast. That's the new one, the second edition coming out.
The geriatric dentist
The
podcast,
geriatric podcast.
right? The second phase of your career.
Oh, goodness. Hey, we were talking about key takeaways. I think something that you guys both keep coming back to is just like your philosophies towards dentistry and your attitudes towards like the type of dentist you want to be, how you want to serve your patients. And I kind of wanted to dive into, I guess, like some key takeaways for our listeners as well, hey, and perhaps some revelations or epiphanies or things that you guys have learned over the years that I think are really fundamental to the types of dentists you guys, whether you identify as a super GP or just a general dentist, whatever it may be, right? And I guess particularly in your focus with like restorative and whatnot, I guess can we go through like a little bit of a back and forth with each of you as just, I guess, key moments that you think define you guys as dentists and just like fundamental principles that shape how you do your day-to-day dentistry?
Look, I think the biggest thing that has helped me in my career, and it's really related to that philosophy of providing the best care possible for my patients, is probably, is the concept of truly building meaningful relationships with our patients, right? I think especially when you're in the same practice for a long time, I think, what I have learned is that none of what I'm doing now would have been possible if I didn't spend the time getting to know my patients and building truly meaningful relationships with those patients. So, to contextualize what I'm about to say, I bought a practice, I bought my first practice 1 year out of uni. So probably the same phase you're at now, Erica. Didn't know anything about, running a business, didn't know anything about dentistry really at that time. And, at that time, it was the Wild West days where, dental practices, it was impossible for dental practices to go out of business, right? So BOQ specialist came along, gave me 100% of the loan. We had no money, had no backup savings, and we just said, hey, let's give it a go, right? And, at that time with no money, obviously you got no money to spend on marketing, anyway, to cut a long story short, I think, we've never really spent money on marketing when it came to our practice. And the only reason why we've survived and why we do reasonably okay in this, now is because I think we spent the time truly getting to know our patients. And, we never tried to pretend what we weren't. And I think, building those relationships also really helped us in terms of one, we really empowered our patients, by communicating effectively with our patients, we really empower them to make the right decisions at the end of the day. And although potentially, some of the patients, some of the patients weren't choosing the appropriate types of dentistry earlier on, once we got to know them and we truly built those relationships and we explained things in terms of, what needed to be done and what was best for their health, what was really meaningful for me was that, we were able to empower our patients to make the best decisions for their health, later on.
Sounds like, I guess, step number one is really building those relationships.
Yeah. Again, I probably was rambling a bit like Bharat as well, but, I think truly, so if we want to sort of summarize all of that, I would say building relationships, learn how to build meaningful relationships by communicating effectively. That's key
Sure.
point number one.
Key
Okay.
point number one. How about you, Brett? What's key point number one that's shaped your attitudes towards dentistry?
I agree with that completely. I think that whole communication piece is massive. And I think that's the first thing everyone should start with really when it comes to CPD is learn how to communicate with patients. Not only will serve you with patients, but also your peers, your support staff as well. So I won't ramble on because I feel like I did a great job rambling on when it comes to point one there. I'll keep it pretty concise, and I'll give you
I'm not going to
key
live this down,
headlines. So,
guys.
so key point number 2. Here we go. So I would say appreciate.
Hey, Brett, can I ramble on for a little bit more?
No, you can't. No, say that for the geriatrics podcast.
No, let me add one thing though. Let me add one thing. Okay. I think when you learn how to communicate effectively, what I would say is like, don't focus on the ROI piece immediately. So don't focus on communicating to sell treatment. Learn how to communicate genuinely to create those relationships. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me. Go on, continue, Brett.
Oh, now I lost my train of thought. Oh, it's such a clear point. Okay, point number 2. No, it's all good. It's all good. Not that all. Key point number 2, I'd say, really for me, reflecting back now, I'd say it's interesting. I've been now dentist 15 years, and look, it is actually a long time. It's gone much quicker than I thought it would have. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago that I just graduated. So for me, there's been, I think, a real sort of like, I think I can break up my 15 years into probably split into 2. And I'd say appreciating that journey is really important. I think the first half of your career, up until this point for me anyways, that first sort of 7-8 years, I think it's daunting, but it's really exciting and it's really fun when it comes to that journey because there's so many wins. You get to celebrate a lot of wins. That's how sort of the first half of my career, you're doing new things, you're learning new things, you get to implement new techniques, stuff that you've just never done before. And the fact that you've delivered it and it's worked and everyone's happy, there's so much joy to be had in that. And I think that's really exciting about that sort of first part of your career. I think enjoying that and being perceptive of that, I think is really, really cool. So I guess celebrate the wins, early on. The second half of your career, I think, is where things become a little bit darker in a different way. Day to day becomes more predictable because those wins that you had in the first part of your career almost become second nature, and it's almost autopilot to say, I've done this now 10 times before, 100 times before, 1,000 times before, 10,000 times before. And now the joy that comes with just being able to deliver it disappears. And for me, really, the second half of my career, where it's become difficult and stuff that I've had to sort of work through to be able to re-enjoy that journey again, is to be perceptive that things will change. I feel like second half of my career now, you focus on, for me anyways, where things have gone wrong because you start seeing things come back after 7-8 years, or the nuance of what you're doing becomes so much clearer that I could have done this ever so slightly differently and my outcome would have been ever so slightly, percentage better as a result of that. So the joy now comes from, for me, going back to my why and my purpose of why I'm doing dentistry. And for me, I've got to remind myself every single day that, even though that nuance is important to me and might get me down and I feel, hard done by because of it, I'm still serving my patients because I went to work that day trying my absolute best to deliver excellent dentistry for them. And I think, enjoying that journey, but also defining like your why you're doing it. Because when you go through that journey, you're going to go through all these different phases and emotions, and there's different challenges at every stage of your career. And I don't think there's ever a time where it just becomes easy, because if it was easy, everyone would be a dentist, right? Like it wouldn't be, I think a special profession or as special as it really is. So that's been a big thing for me. And I think Yohan, I'm really grateful for like the friends and the mentors that I've had along the way, because, I think they've seen they've gone through the journey themselves, or they've seen me go through that journey, and they've been there for me to support me as I've sort of learned to adapt to those different changes. And I think, I think I think it's important to be perceptive of that as a new grad, that as much as things will get easy in different ways later on, it never really truly becomes easy. So just remember why you're doing it, and there's such a strong why for all of us really at the core of it. It's not about, getting paid or having that glory case on Instagram or the accolades that come with, doing, really nice, beautiful dentistry. But really the core purpose is that stuff that we do every single day, that kid that you did a checkup on when they were 4 and now they're, 20, going to university, studying dentistry or whatever it is. Like that for me is those sort of full circle moments of like, this kid wouldn't sit in the chair and now he's doing dentistry. Like that's crazy for me to look back and see that.
You made a comment about like the mistakes that you made, right? Do you feel like over time, like our attitude or like the types of mistakes that bring you down differ? I guess like, early on, anything that we do feels like the end of the world, but it might be, oh, because I couldn't get a tooth out, or patient had some sensitivity after you didn't do ideas properly, or something like that, right? But then over time, because you made a comment about, oh, it's now seeing work that you maybe did 5 years ago, and then with the knowledge that you have now, realizing, oh, I wish I would have done that different. Like, do you think the mistakes and the challenges have evolved, and in what way have they changed?
Yeah, I think, look, we're at the end of the day, we're all human. I think we're going to afford ourselves some, grace to say that things will, go wrong from time to time. But what will change? And I think that's something like I always like when I talk to my new grads, that I mentor, new grads that I've hired, I always talk about that first year as a roller coaster. And I really think it is. If you graft it, it'll look literally like a roller coaster of highs and lows and everything in between. And I call that the new grad roller coaster. And I think that roller coaster, what happens is, the highs and lows sort of get, further apart as you sort of, do it for longer and longer, sort of, flatlines a little bit. But the mistakes, when I say mistakes, I mean, everything feels like it's such a big deal in the moment. And I think sometimes it's taking a step away and looking at the situation for what it is important. And to think that there's always something to be learned from each of those mistakes. There's always an opportunity to grow and say, hey, how would I do this differently next time? Because the moment you just look at a mistake and go, okay, next patient, whatever, like, shit happens. Like that's, I think the worst thing you can do when things go wrong. I think when something goes wrong, you don't beat yourself up about it, but go, hey, how could I do this differently? Or, would someone else have approached it differently? And I think it comes back to that humility piece of what I talked about earlier, go to your peers and say, hey, how would you have done this? Would you have done something differently? Or, did I screw up? How do I fix this? And like I was saying, I think really in this latter half, I wouldn't say latter half of your career, I still feel like I've got another, 20 years in me at least of dentistry. Not that old. Come on.
You make it sound like you're about to die, Bharat. You okay, bro?
No, I'm
You
not dying
okay?
anytime. I'm not dying anytime soon. I'm going to live forever. I'm going to live forever.
Yeah.
We're going to go listen to a Huberman podcast after this. That's a nice stuff. No,
Yeah.
no, I think your perspective changes, and I think just being aware of that it's not always going to be like this. It's not always going to feel like that. The challenges will still come. It's not going to always be easy, but what are you going to do to prepare yourself to be ready for it when it happens? And I don't think I was necessarily prepared for that, and I think that's why I'm sharing this with yourselves and your listeners, because for me, it's taken a lot of work in the last sort of 12 to 24 months to really figure out why I went from dentistry feeling so predictable in my hands and feeling confident about everything that I was doing. When you sort of go over that little edge of like everything just is now predictable, I know how to do what I do day to day, to now going, hey, why does it feel hard again? And I think for me, it was that realization of, I think I'm in that different phase in my career now where I don't have those like that pat on the back every single day that I either give myself or my patients give me, because the expectation just is that the work should work and it should be to a standard that they're used to or accustomed to, or the reason, or how I portray myself, or why how I put myself out there. So the battles for me were different, of going, hey, I've got to be perceptive that maybe the things that I'm, fussing over or getting upset about or beating myself up over aren't really the end of the world. They can either be corrected or fixed. And, it comes to the fact that I've always prioritized that contingency plan of, when things go wrong, do I have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D? I need to go to plan Z straight away as my first line of treatment. And that sort of minimally invasive philosophy has served me well, as I've sort of gone through that journey as well.
Point number 3, Johan, have you got another fundamental or principle?
Yeah, so I think my third point would be very related to what Bharat has just said, right? And I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's okay to feel the highs, and it's really important to also acknowledge the fact that we can feel the lows during dentistry. And I think, it's important to learn how to cope with those highs and also those lows. So I think it's equally important to make sure that when you are feeling on top of the world, to be able to say, yes, this is a really good win, but now we have to come and back it up and really, do it again, right? And then I think also when you experience your lows, it's really important to understand that I think it's really important to not beat yourself up over your lows or your self-perceived failure. Because at the end of the day, we like to call ourselves doctors, but they're just teeth, right? And there's so many other really important parts of life, family, friends, life experiences, and dentistry. At the end of the day, we need to remember is we can be passionate about it, but we shouldn't let it define us as individuals, because your perceived failure, your self-perceived failure in dentistry, or your self-perceived, win in dentistry doesn't define you. There is a Bharat behind. There's a human Bharat behind the dentist. There's a human me behind myself. There's a human you, Erica. And I think it's really important that your self-worth is not related to your performance at work. All right. So I think that's really, really important to remember. So as I was saying, I'm losing my trail of thought now in my old age, Erica. But really to make sure that completely lost it now. Yeah. But yeah, to not beat yourself, up over,
Yeah.
dentistry. Yeah, really lost it.
No, that's really
It's
good.
nice seeing you age with grace, Yohan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's been one of my
You're
great.
human.
And last point, I think this really, really relates to what you do, Erica, and what you're really creating for your listeners as well, is find your community, and find your why, find your community. If you don't have a mentor, it doesn't matter. Find out people who are going through the same journey as you. I think at the end of the day, we've had some amazing mentors along the way, but the people I've truly learned the most from and been inspired by are my immediate circle. So people like Bharat, people like David Attier as well. My business partner, David Chang. Those people are really the ones who have had the most profound influence on my career. So, I think find your circle. And I think what you're doing, Erica, for your community is absolutely amazing.
Thank you, Johan. I appreciate that. One of the questions that I guess we kind of talked about before was the concept of being super GDPs, right? And you guys were exploring this idea. I guess I suppose that maybe it opens up a can of worms, but someone asked in the group about how do you know if you are ready to take on bigger work, right? Or how do you know if you're ready to tackle full mouth rehab? How is it within your scope? How do you know if it's within your scope? You mentioned that before as well, Johan. It's just what is the scope of a general dentist? What starts becoming a specialist territory? And it's just understanding what you're capable of. I guess, would you have advice on what things you think you should know really well? As a general, we talked before a lot about diagnosis, treatment planning, but in some ways, when you don't know what you don't know, it can seem a bit airy-fairy. Are there key things that you think new guys should really understand?
I think to really summarize the point initially is that I think you need to be able to complete the case to a standard where when that case goes in front of a panel of our peers, it needs to be done to a standard where they, nothing goes right perfect. Nothing is perfect, and there may be things wrong with it, but I do think that your panel of your peers need to look at the case and go yes, that person was competent and they understood the fundamentals of the case, right? So I think that's clear to sort of clarify at the beginning. Now, I think to understand in a rehab sort of thing, to understand what those fundamentals actually are, I think the basics are one, I think we need to truly be able to diagnose and assess our patients. So not only diagnose the initial condition, but then to truly understand the risk factors associated with what got them into the condition in the first place, and what risk factors may potentially compromise the longevity of the case and the prognosis of the case longer term, right? So I think that's number one. So I think, some of the best education that I've had with regards to that has really been from the Choi Center. I know your brother Paul has also done that stuff, Erica, as well. And I think you'll talk to a lot of people who've been to the Choi Center, and they'll all say that that's probably one of the strongest things that you learn at the Choi Center, where you learn how to truly sort of risk assess your patients, and to make sure that your work is going to last long term. So I think that's the first thing, fundamental one. Then I think when it comes to, then it comes to actually doing the dentistry itself, I think it really starts with the basics that we learn when it comes to simple dentistry, the bread and butter stuff. So when it comes to being able to prep a single tooth, if you can't prep a single tooth perfectly, then, it's very hard to then prep 14, 28 teeth perfectly. So I think understanding how a tooth needs to be prepared in an optimal manner, and then everything associated with that. So making sure that your margins are visible, knowing how to either take effective scans or impressions of those preparations. And then I think the final part as well, there's a lot of parts to it, but the next part would be occlusion, and learning how to cement things. And I think a lot of these things really you start understanding from the bread and butter stuff. And, although sometimes it can seem quite mundane, the bread and butter dentistry on a daily basis can appear to be quite boring at times. And it may not be very flashy. It may not be very, very entertaining. But I think they provide us with such key lessons because it's that muscle memory, right? It's, understanding how to prep a single tooth, because once you can do a single tooth really, really well, then it's not a stretch to imagine then you go, well, I can now do 2 teeth really well. I can do 3 teeth really well. And then eventually you do get to the stage where you feel confident managing a bigger case. But I think it's a very, very hard question to answer specifically, Erica, because it's something that you have to answer for yourself. I think you have to look back on your experiences. You have to be able to accurately ascertain what your individual competencies are. And then once you feel confident with it, and I think what can help is what, as Bharat was saying earlier in the podcast, in terms of having that help, that support system around you, having mentors, having contingency plans, having someone to potentially bail you out or help you out on a case as well. I think once you consider all those factors, you can really make that decision in terms of, yes, I can do this case. So I wouldn't really listen to the background noise. I think if you ask a lot of specialists, if you ask, a lot of, if you were to ask, people, a lot of people out there, some people will say that rehab should never be in the scope of a general dentist. Some people will say, yes, definitely it's within the scope of a general dentist. But I think at the end of the day, the core premise is that we need to make sure that our patients are receiving the optimal treatment. So you need to look inside and make sure that you truly believe that you are competent prior to embarking, some of this life-changing treatment.
Dentistry, particularly as a new grad, is stressful enough as it is. And so if there's anything we can do to minimize all the external factors we need to think about, I'm all for it. Nothing is more daunting than the prospect of a patient complaint, especially in our early years. Thanks to Dental Protection Limited, I know I can sleep a little easier. Now, I've been working alongside DPL for years now, since my student days, and they have always been such huge supporters of everything I do, including the launch of the Graduate Dentist podcast. And so I know when push comes to shove and the time calls for it, I can trust DPL to have my back and to be in my corner. With a team of experienced dental legal consultants and an abundance of resources, including webinars, their own podcasts, magazines, which, by the way, I've written some articles for, DPL's got you covered. If you signed up as a student, you are automatically covered for your first 18 months of practice for free. Thank you, DPL, for always looking after me and for supporting the Graduate Dentist podcast.
Can I just add to that as well? I think realistically, when it comes to complex treatments, we really need to think about breaking down complex treatments into more simple components first. And with every single rehabilitation or an indirect veneer case, for example, let's go one step even, sort of back from that. There are so many elements that make an excellent veneer case, for example. You need to be able to, obviously, aesthetically diagnose well. Do you know all of your aesthetic parameters back to front? And I think that's really, if you want to get into the world of aesthetics and rehabilitation, really changing the appearance of someone, can you automatically see, where the midline sits relative to the dental midline? Can you see the embrasure forms? Can you see the contact points and their relationships to one another? Can you see the axial inclinations? Do you know how they all relate to each other? Can you objectively identify each of those things. I think that would be the first thing for anyone who's looking to get into the world of aesthetics, for example, is, do you know your parameters well enough? Then from there, it's really, can you prep a tooth well enough? Do you have enough of the hand skill and the control to be able to go, the inclination of my burr is appropriately aligned with the plane that I'm trying to prepare? Is my margin clear enough? And then can you impress one tooth to be able to impress 10 teeth? How well can you do each of those individual components? And then is your adhesive protocol good enough? Have you seen enough of your restorations come back without post-operative sensitivity, without marginal leakage, without deep bonding? If your fillings, suffer from post-operative sensitivity and falling out, then maybe the last thing to do is cement 10 beautiful veneers only to have to, cut them off because, something adhesively went wrong if your ceramics delivered. And then when your ceramics delivers the work, do you have enough of an understanding of those aesthetic, parameters to go, have they delivered on what your and the patient's vision was? You haven't just relied on the technician providing it. So I think for anyone who's listening and they want to get into this world is, really set that as your goal, but set yourself tangible, smaller goals within that to go, okay, I'm going to learn my aesthetic principles this week. I'm going to look at every single patient who walks into my clinical practice, whether they want it or not, and be able to formulate an aesthetic checklist. These are the things that are causing visual tension. These are the things that I could change. This is how I would approach it. And obviously don't present it to the patient if they're not asking for treatment or have a perceived problem, but you're doing that as an exercise for yourself. And that comes back to, the first purchase I think any new graduate should make is a camera. You need to take photos of your work. If you're not taking photos of your work and your cases, you cannot see what you're doing. And we're talking at a, not a macro tooth level basis. We're talking at, a global perspective, looking at the patient's face and how everything else relates to one another. So I think setting yourself little tangible goals, and then once you've checked all of those off, and then you're in the right environment, you've got the right training, you're now ready to start embarking on those bigger cases. So I think a little bit of self-perception there, but also at the end of the day, I always say some of the best aesthetic cases and the best life-changing cases aren't the ones where, you drilled the most amount of tooth away. The ones that are the best ones are the ones where you drilled the least amount of tooth away. And, my philosophy has always been, let's get to that end point with doing the least amount of dentistry possible. And I think if you can nail those cases every day of the week, there's so much joy to be had in those cases. And then you can start, building up to, okay, now I'm going to do like more indirect units. I'm going to mix and match or do, a more complex rehabilitation, but I'm going to use a reversible material like composite, where I can modify and change and adjust and not go straight to ceramic rehabilitation. So it can be tricky when I say it like this, but I think when you have that sort of guidance and those points to go, okay, these are my steps to get, up the ladder, it becomes a lot more accessible and a lot more predictable to get there.
Yeah, I really like how you guys both broke that down and starting off with just, as you both said, assessing it holistically rather than just going straight to like, okay, I'm going to pick up a burr and start drilling teeth. It's, well, do you really need to do that? Or are there other ways or are there better ways to manage the patient? And like, you've got your assessment, you've got your diagnosis, you figured out what's the most minimally invasive way that I can help achieve their outcome. But then when it actually comes to executing it, it's it comes back to what you were saying, Johan, earlier about the accumulation of marginal gains, right? It's just like, okay,
Mm.
doing an entire case seems really like a huge mountain to overcome. But if you can do one tooth really well, then okay, let's try two teeth. And if you can do two teeth really well and know that it's predictable in your hands and you've seen it come back and you know it works, then it's not so much of a stretch to then do four teeth. And then,
Mm.
that comes in. I guess that's why when people ask us, like, oh, when am I ready? Everyone might differ. Some people may be ready and see that, really quickly, whereas other people may take years. Everyone runs their own race and you travel at different paces. But when the stage at which you master those skills, I guess, differs for everyone, right?
I think
Mhm.
don't be influenced about what your friend is doing. Some people, as you said, Eric, you hit the nail on the head. Some people are going to be ready earlier. Some people are going to be like, some people are going to be ready a lot later. And if you don't get ready, like, there's no shame in doing that, because the end goal of, our purpose within dentistry is not to be able to do the rehab or to do veneer. Like, not everyone has to be able to do that, right? That's, not being able to do that doesn't mean you don't end up having a fulfilling career. To be honest, they're sometimes the most stressful cases, even though we know what we're doing, like, sometimes they're the most stressful cases that come into our book. And I think at the end of the day, if you remember that whatever you do, you're trying to do trying to achieve the best outcomes for your patients, then, you just have to follow your journey and make sure that you feel comfortable going along that journey as well.
I always say on the podcast as well, it's just that I very much identify as just a very general dentist, right? Like I'm a new grad. I'm not doing anything flash. There's a lot of new grads and a lot of like my really good friends that do incredible work, right? And I'm like, I'm very much a general dentist and I recognize that I learn slower, right? But I feel like even I mentioned it earlier in the episode as well that I feel like a lot of my focus this year is just learning and seeing what I didn't previously see. Am I executing things at this point? No. And then perhaps that's, my goal over the next few years is actually okay, I've started to see things now and I want to execute it, right? But hearing what you guys were saying, but it's like, okay, can you do one thing well, right? And I'm just like, okay, like it's doing things bit by bit, right? It's easy to be like, oh, but so and so is doing all this crazy stuff and so is doing all of that stuff. And like, that's okay. Like I'm not at that point yet. Like I'm we're over here. So we just gotta master this bit first. And then when I get over this hurdle, then I'll think about the next hurdle. But there's no point chasing after what someone else is doing when you're still working on this bit, right?
Yeah, you just got to run your own race. And there's nothing
Mhm.
wrong with being fast or slow. If anything, I
Mhm.
think, going too fast, is
Mhm.
probably going to come to bite you in the rear end more so than not. So,
Yeah. Hey, Brett, you mentioned before, and I really want to dive into this concept of like the contingency plans. And I wanted to see if you could expand on that a little bit more when you said when you take on a case or any situation, you're always thinking about plan B, plan C, plan D, whatever it may be. Can you kind of explain that a little bit? Like, what is your thought process? And an
Yeah, I think,
example, maybe?
yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. I think Johan and I were really lucky to be invited to join the bioemulation group a few years ago. And I think their philosophy really, really surmises what we're talking about. And they talk about um, observe, preserve, conserve, right? And it's all about serving your patients. So the serve at the end is like very intentional why they talk about that. So if your philosophy is always driven by conservation, then the contingency plan becomes very, very simple. So what an example of this really is, if a patient comes in and they've got a perceived aesthetic problem and they're in my chair because they say they're unhappy with their smile, the last thing that I want to do is say, hey, you don't have a problem. I'm an MI dentist. See you later. Like, you don't need dentistry, right? And as much as sometimes that is the conversation we need to have with patients, and it's often a conversation that we're guiding them towards, is that no dentistry is better than having dentistry. Firstly, we need to acknowledge that there's a problem. Now, if there is a perceived problem, particularly if it's an elective and small problem, say, for example, I have patients who come in and they might have minor form imperfections of one or two teeth in their overall smile. The answer isn't to have 10 veneers for that patient, which is sometimes what I see being treatment planned for these cases. It's about effectively diagnosing why they're unhappy with those few forms, how they sit in balance to the rest of the smile. And then for me, applying my philosophy of conservation to say, is there a better way to achieve that endpoint to go, can we derotate those teeth slightly? Maybe use some additive composite, for example, or some minor odontoplasty to reshape things. So the contingency always has to be the first and foremost consideration. And that's the driving force for the conversations that I have with my patients to go, everything that I do has a finite longevity because you use your teeth thousands of times per year to do things with them that are going to generate lots of forces and cause a lot of stress on whatever I put inside your mouth. Now, invariably, when things fail, we need to talk about what is going to happen next. When so-and-so modality fails, these are the different options that we have to correct things. And say, for example, we use, composite bonding versus, say, a full coverage labial composite veneer or even ceramic veneer, right? I sort of classify them almost the same. When edge bonding fails, for example, it fails usually within the resin itself or at the interface between the tooth and the resin. Very rarely does, you get a cohesive fracture of the tooth as well. And that's a very simple thing for the patient to then understand, to say, well, when things go wrong, I can either choose to A, have this repaired, have this polished and recontoured, or maybe I'll be at a point in my life where that aesthetic issue that I had is no longer a problem. I just have it removed. It's fine. When a veneer fails, whether it's composite or ceramic, the question is what happens next? Is the tooth going to fail with it? I'm not sure. If, repair is not easy, how much does it cost to repair it? And we talk about all those, I guess, the sequelae of all of the issues that can arise from the failure of that modality of treatment. The same thing goes with like posterior adhesive dentistry, for example. When an overlay fails, right? What's your contingency? You can now do a overlay that extends, more apically, and it might eventually turn into a crown, 20, 30, 40 years down the track. But what happens when, your 2 millimeter, shoulder margin on your crown fails? it's likely that the tooth is going to decoronate. You're going to lose, all of your ferrule that you have, and you don't have a plan B. So it's more of a mindset thing than anything to say, is everything I'm doing based on achieving the objective of my patient's aesthetic goals, their functional goals, their health goals, but am I doing it from the perspective of knowing that when things fail, I've considered that there's another option. And if there isn't another option, sometimes there just is no other option. The patient is well aware that, there is no contingency. The plan B is that so-and-so is going to need to happen. Now, obviously, this is more relevant when we're talking about elective treatments. And I think that's where it can get very, very, hairy when you start doing elective treatments for patients where they have, what you would classify as very minor shortcomings. And you've done treatments that really have no plan B. Because at that point there really is no leg to stand on to go, maybe that treatment shouldn't have been done in the first place. Now that things have failed, the patient is way worse off than they were to start with.
It's I did an episode earlier in the year with John Hagliosis, and we opened up this whole can of worms, kind of tied into what you said, Johan, about like whatever work you do right now, if you put it in front of a board of peers and like 5, 10, 15 years, can you still back it up, right? And he's been practicing for 25 years. So you guys aren't the oldest dentists that I've had on the podcast, hey? But John was just saying how it's just like he's had that, I guess, like hindsight of seeing work done, years ago, right? Whereas as new guys, we haven't really, right? Like, fillings, at most fillings we've only got a
Mhm.
2 year comparison of, and we don't know what work we will do, how long it will last. But the can of worms we opened up was just like, what work do we do right now? I wonder in like 5, 10, 15 years time will be
Mhm.
redundant or seem crazy. Like, what do we do right now will be like the amalgams of back then, of 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah. So I think on that point, Eric, is really important. I think, related to that whole educational development journey piece as well, Erica. I think it's really important to learn from a wide range of people. So I think it's really important to learn, CPD can't be from one source only. I think CPD needs to be from a source where, if you're inspired by people who are, only a few steps ahead of you in terms of, like let's say they're 2 years, 3 years ahead of you, they're doing killer work and they really inspire you. Yeah, look, I think it's really good that you go off and learn from them in terms of what they're doing to make sure that what they're doing to help them achieve successful outcomes. But then I do think you should also learn from people who have probably like the Johns, right? The people who have been fortunate enough to be in the same place to see their follow-ups, to really look at to really sort of look at what has worked and what has stood the test of time as well. And I think that's really important because, I think in this day and age where you do see these beautiful before and afters on social media, the thing is that's like the last time we get to see those cases sometimes, right? You get to see this beautiful smile makeover, it's all done and you go, wow, that's a fantastic result. But then you don't know what's happened afterwards. You don't know if like there's patients like you've had like 10 bonds, if you've had like a whole mouthful of ceramic just chipping off, or the patient's developed like occlusal dysfunction or TMD or whatever. So I think it's really important to also be able to learn from people who've been doing it for like a much longer time as well.
Another guest that we had earlier on in this year, I actually think this is kind of interesting to hear things from the flip side, right? But I
Mm.
had Raina on as a guest earlier this year, and we talked about her journey in dentistry. And she shared that one of the big transitional moments for her was when she learnt from the two of you, right? And attending your courses, and then how that really changed the way that she approached dentistry and doing really good, solid work, and particularly this focus on adhesive dentistry, right? I'm curious to explore your journey in teaching yourselves as general dentists because I think even Stratum itself has been running for like 8 or so years, right? How did you guys
Yeah.
come up with your own, I guess, philosophy towards dentistry, the work that you want to do, and then teaching it? Because, something like, oh, and I only really have the experience of attending Stratum to compare with, right? But the philosophies that went into it. And this comes back to, I guess, like, what you were saying even before, Brad, about like your contingency plans and making sure every step is done really well. I'm curious about, I guess, yeah, the thoughts and the philosophies, your learnings that then shaped into what you now try to teach.
Look, I think in terms of our philosophy, I think, is pretty similar to day one. And I think, Brad is, to just make clear, Brad is the more geriatric of the two of us. And so, I would probably say Brad is probably one of my earliest mentors as well. Like I didn't know it at the time, but I've learned so much from Bharat. And, a lot of my philosophy has sort of been based on what Bharat's philosophy was because, I really liked the way he did dentistry. I really liked what he stood for at the time. I think, if I don't want to talk for Bharat, I think Bharat's influences really probably come from from his mentors, like, the Sabir Banerjees of the world, the people like the Chris Ho's of the world who do, really stand for achieving the best outcomes for their patients, right? So, in terms of philosophy, I think that's really how it started. We always, firmly believe that dentistry had to be for our patients and had to be done in a minimally invasive way. It had to be done in a way which is, which slows down that sort of the death cycle for teeth, right? To ensure that patients keep their teeth for life. And then I guess what's really happened is that over time, we've probably more refined our philosophy a bit as the years go by, because we've seen what also works and what doesn't work. Because sometimes being minimally invasive for the sake of being minimally invasive, Erica, I think sometimes can be more disastrous long term, because it just, one, it doesn't, sometimes being too minimally invasive might not achieve the expectations of our patients, number one. Two, it may not be preventing things in the way they need to be preventing things, in terms of the risk factors. So I think really in terms of experience, we've said, yes, at the core of everything that we stand for is making sure that the outcomes are as optimal as they can be, that we're doing everything in the best interest of our patients. But I think we've really refined the process of doing, and I think it's sort of, come with becoming more proficient at a wider facet of dentistry as well in that time. We're able to be more selective in terms of the most appropriate option for that patient at that moment in their life. So I think that's probably more, that was more to answer the philosophy piece in terms of like, how that sort of developed over time. So external influences, anecdotal influences in terms of like what we've been practicing every day as well. Is there anything you want to add to that, Bharat?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think really for us, the philosophy is the most important part of everything that we do. The why of, your practicing, like the why you practice is going to define where your career ends up. And at a bigger level, I think as a group and as a whole, and which is, why I love, when people like yourselves get people aligned. I think when people do that, I think that's so important, because we have this opportunity now to really shape our profession, because we now have like a collective voice of people who potentially feel the same way. And I think for me, it's always been driven from obviously caring for our patients, but also from a selfish perspective. I love our profession. I love what it's given me as far as, a life and purpose, and, the ability to serve, my patients. But if that changed and I look back in say 20, 30 years and thought that the profession ended up in a direction that I was truly deeply against, philosophically, then I feel like we failed.
You sound so old, Bharat.
I can't help. I am old.
Bharat, I love the message, but I just love the fact that you're so old.
Yeah, I can't help it. And for me, realistically, despite me being old, I would hate to get older and look back and go, hey, we did nothing within our power to change the direction in which the profession went. And for me, I truly believe that, if we can get that message out there to more clinicians and more young clinicians, that what's aspirational is not your day one review of an all on X patient who's, who could have had, orthodontics and, maybe some hygiene. That what's really to be celebrated is, the patient who never needed that all on X, because the general dentist did enough for them to educate them, to help them, to guide them, to assist them, to help them make better decisions when treatment was required. I think that's what should be celebrated. And I think if that message was loud enough, and if we had that platform to make sure it was loud enough, I think that would be important. And that really was where, for us, getting into teaching was really never a goal. It was never, I talk a lot about setting goals and having a vision of where you want your career to go. There was never a time where educating or even teaching or even being considered a mentor to anyone. And, I'm so humbled to hear Raina even mention that we had a small part to play in her career. That was never part of our never part of our goal to do that. But what that has allowed us to have is a platform to spread that philosophy. And if we can help you do better dentistry, but also feel differently about dentistry, if that philosophy is, swaying for whatever reason because of external influences, whether it's where you work, whether it's what you see on social media, whether it's what your friends are doing, whether, whatever it might be. And I think it's so hard for new grads now because we had noise when we graduated, but it was never as loud as the noise that you guys have now. There's so much good, but so much bad intertwined. Like you guys almost everything's amplified at this point here. Whereas, when we had just graduated, the noise was, it was there, but it wasn't in your face all the time. So I think now more than ever, I think we need to have these conversations, and I appreciate you letting me ramble when it comes to this, because this truly is like the fundamental to what we do and why we do what we do now. Yeah, that's one of my core purposes.
Yeah, but I think that's what's also changed for us in terms of philosophy as well, Erica. Like in terms of our mission and what's changed with regards to that. At the beginning, it was just to really, when we were only a few steps ahead, it was really just to share what we were doing, to help others similar to us achieve good results for their patients as well. But as we have gotten older and potentially become a little bit more influential to younger dentists as well, I think we do feel it's a good burden, right? But there is definitely a burden. And I think there's definitely what we feel is a responsibility to stand for the right things and to really sort of, even if it's only one person who listens to us, we hope that that one person, because of us, is going to, in a small way, be influenced in the right direction to treat their patients better.
And when it comes to that sort of like responsibility and burden, I think that really has changed for us over the years. You sort of asked about our sort of growth with Instagram and things like that. You'll probably notice that we post a lot less than we used to and share a lot less than we used to. And there's a very intentional reason why that's probably the case with what we do as well. For me, I feel a responsibility to never share like an immediate post of what I've done. For me, I want to share cases I did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, to know that whatever I'm putting out there, if there is someone sitting there potentially, and I always say Instagram's not the place to learn dentistry, but if someone is sitting there and they take something away from what I put out there, I want to make sure that it's been tried and tested and it wasn't a fluke case where something just, miraculously looked great in that moment, but didn't look great, 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years later. So, things have changed for us from that perspective as well, the way that we sort of see Instagram. And I think really, and this is a little bit philosophical as well, but I think everyone who puts stuff out there on social media or in the public space really has like a responsibility to their peers, their patients, their peers, to, show what's realistic, to show what's possible, and to really sort of show things that work, not just, moments and fleeting moments in time of excellence where, I think that's what's sort of, for us, it's inhibitory and also positive. But, I take that responsibility pretty seriously to go, hey, if I'm going to show something, it better work and it better have some value to someone. I'm not just going to show it before and after to get a pat on the back, because those, like I said, the first half of my career where accolades were, whether good thing in the wins, that's kind of disappeared for me now. I don't get as much joy out of that anymore. I mean, I still wait to hear the day that Yohan says one of my cases is good. He rarely says anything I do is good. That's kind of my motivation now for the second half of my career, to
That's your driver.
Get a pat on the back from Yohan one day.
Don't die on us too soon, Bharat, if you want to hear those words.
No, I really love that. And I love what you guys stand for, and that, like, the responsibility of ensuring that, what people are exposed to is like, we're trying to look after our profession. But also, as you were talking, Brad, I was just thinking back to, at the end of the day, it's like looking after our patients as well, and just changing dentistry for the general population, right? I was just thinking back to all the patients that we see, and they talk about the dentistry that they experienced when they were younger. I guess it's now our responsibility, of providing good treatment so that, our patients in the future, when they're talking to their new dentist, right? We're not the same. It's not that same story of like, oh, back then this dentist did all of this to me. And I really love the story that you shared where you said, what's most rewarding is seeing a patient that you saw at 4 years old, and like, you did early intervention, did all these things to prevent them from needing crazy work. Or, I think you mentioned it as well, Johan, like jumping in early so that your patient doesn't need an all-on-X, doesn't need a full mouth rehab. It's so interesting that we are, I think thinking back, we have so much power, right?
I think, Erica, is so important. So many patients nowadays will come to the dentist and say, I hate the dentist. No offense, right? Don't take it personally. But I think, again, like, why can't we give them a better experience, with fresh eyes? And and I hope that, like, in 20, 30 years time, where patients come in, like these kids come in and go, hey, I actually love the dentist. That dentist I had as a kid was absolutely amazing. Like they really sort of, they fix like these white spots on my teeth, or they really help fix my bite. And now, and people have like really reaped the benefit of good dentistry, like good conservative MI dentistry. Like I guess, why can't they say that, right? As a profession, I think it's really up to us to take it on board, to change that public perception of what we do. And, hopefully, not only we can, I think we need to appreciate what we do first and foremost. I think that's been a big topic of today's conversation. I think so we appreciate what we do. We see value in what we do. But then I guess the next role is to do it in the right way so that the public is really going to value what we do as well.
I'll just add as well to that. I think from a framing perspective, we reframe our mindset as to how we approach those MI cases as well. Things change very rapidly. One of the biggest moments for me where it made sense why chasing all those big glory cases that came with high risk and stress and all those things, that we talked about already, once you become proficient at doing really great MI dentistry, it's not that you can't charge enough money for your time to be able to deliver great, MI dentistry. At the start of your career, you do a lot of that kind of work for the love of it, to build your skills, particularly when it comes to composite dentistry and adhesive dentistry. But I know for a fact, Yohan and I both, from a financial perspective, charge enough to do that kind of dentistry where it's still viable for our businesses to succeed and survive, because we became proficient at it. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to charge for your time and your expertise when it comes to that kind of dentistry. And for me, that reframing moment really was thinking about it from the perspective of how much would this patient pay me, and how much time and effort would they invest if it meant I didn't have to drill their tooth away? And the answer is so obvious to every single dentist that is probably listening to this to go, hey, if I could pay more money to not have my tooth drilled away and get the same result, what would I do? I'd pay twice as much for my invisible veneers. Then the veneers are going to cut my tooth away, or the crown's going to cut my tooth away when I didn't really need it. So when you reframe it like that, and I often use that phrase with my patients, is, how much time and effort and money are you willing to pay to not have to do, aggressive dentistry? And, I often hear people decline ortho and not want to spend the time doing long-term whitening and things like that. Everyone wants like instant gratification. And when I frame it like that, it just becomes so much clearer to myself and my patients.
I really love that. I feel like that was a really nice deep dive into like your philosophies. I think it's a really important and really powerful message to share with our audience. Um, so thank you guys for sharing. Were there any final, I guess, like parting words I feel like this entire episode we've been sharing a lot of words of wisdom. Usually, my last question is always, we have a lot of conversations with people day to day, and I wanted to see if you guys had any interesting conversations or stories to share, perhaps with patients or with like your mentees, or even with one another, that you think would be valuable to share with our graduate dentist audience. I think this entire conversation has been sharing of these
Yeah.
stories and things, but I guess last words to wrap up the podcast.
Yeah, I think find yourself, find your why, be confident in what you're doing, walk your own race. I think, basically everything we've been saying summarized is really what we do. And, what I'd really sort of, if you don't know, so I think to young dentists out there, if you want to see it in action, reach out to Brad and I. We're always accessible. If you want to come and shadow us in our clinics to see what we do on a daily basis, you're more than welcome. To really come and see. And if that helps inspire one person out there to do better and go on this journey that we've gone on, in a more modern way, of course, Erica, then I think our we've achieved our mission. So thank you a lot for having us on today.
Yeah, I think I'd really, I'd agree with everything Johan said. And for me, looking back to when I was a young grad, I think just going back, and if I could just tell myself that, hey, this is just a massive journey, and, enjoy it for what it is, and, continue to just put your head down and do what's best for your patients and best for you in that moment, and forget about everything else that's going on around you. Just use that as inspiration and motivation to want to keep doing it. I think really for me, that's the key, just being very clear in why you're doing it, what your goals are, and then using everything else around you to, uplift you and push you towards that. And I guess when things are tough and difficult, and, you have those tricky days at work where you have a dissatisfied patient and things like that, as long as you remember that you've gone in every single day doing your absolute best, and your desire and your motivation was to always be the best for that person in that moment, then really you've done everything you can, because the rest is, well, partly dentistry is just really difficult and it's hard. And I think you've got to cut yourself some slack to go, hey, it's a difficult profession to do really well all the time. But just knowing that you have done everything you can to be the best version of yourself, I think that's really important. So enjoy the experience, enjoy dentistry, and I guess continue to champion good dentistry and uplift it for what it should be and what it's worth.
I love that. That's a really nice message to share. And despite I really appreciate having you guys both on the podcast. And despite all the banter and all the jokes and all the old jokes, it's all good. Truly, you guys are both really wonderful mentors. And I think I speak on behalf of a lot of our new grads that you are people that we look up to. And we're grateful that you are approachable and young enough that we can still go to you and we can still chat to you on Instagram and have these conversations on the podcast. And I think, it's a nice message to share to all our listeners. And I hope we continue working together on helping look after our profession, but looking after our patients as well.
Thanks for having us, Erica. Really appreciate
having
it.
us, Erica. Really enjoyed being on today.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of the Graduate Dentist Podcast. I really hope you've taken something valuable away from this episode and that you feel heard, you feel seen, inspired, and optimistic about our journey as graduate dentists. As I always say, we're in it together, so let's spread the word, let's share the love, send this to your friends, your colleagues, and those who are on a similar path who you feel may benefit from being part of the community. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so send me a message, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time for another episode.